It is a moonless night in occupied France. The date is March 11th, 1944. In a village square somewhere in Normandy, a German sentry paces in slow, rhythmic circles beneath the pale glow of a single electric lamp. He pauses. He lights a cigarette. He exhales. Somewhere in the darkness behind him, roughly 40 meters away, a figure presses flat against a hedgerow, barely breathing, watching every movement with the patient stillness of a man who has done this before. The figure raises a weapon to his shoulder. It is compact, oddly proportioned, shorter than a standard rifle but heavier in the barrel, with a thick, swollen shroud of metal that wraps the muzzle in a cylinder no larger than a rolling pin. The operator exhales slowly. He squeezes the trigger. There is no bang. There is no crack. There is, for a fraction of a second, a sound roughly equivalent to someone snapping a small twig underfoot. Then silence. The sentry slumps. The cigarette falls from his fingers and fizzes out on the cobblestones. The figure in the hedgerow has already begun to move, folding back into the darkness as completely as though he had never existed. This is the Lisle Commando Carbine, and if you have never heard of it, that is rather fitting, because neither did its victims. The Lisle is not, strictly speaking, a rocket. It is an integrally suppressed bolt-action carbine, hand-built in small numbers by British engineers during the Second World War. But its story is the story of a particular kind of British ingenuity, quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective, that emerged not from grand industrial programs or vast research institutions, but from a small team working against impossible deadlines in conditions of extreme secrecy. It is a story about what happens when you strip warfare back to its barest essentials and ask a very simple question. What if the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield was the one nobody could hear? To understand why the Lisle was built, you need to understand the particular problem it was designed to solve, and how catastrophically existing solutions had failed to solve it. By 1941, the Special Operations Executive, formed at Churchill's personal direction the previous year with the instruction to set Europe ablaze, had begun deploying agents across occupied Europe. These men and women operated in conditions of permanent, nerve-shredding danger. Their missions required, on occasion, the swift and silent elimination of specific targets, sentries, informants, collaborators, without alerting anyone within earshot. The standard tools available for this purpose were, to put it diplomatically, inadequate. The Well-Rod, a purpose-built assassination pistol, developed at Station 9 in Welwyn Garden City, was genuinely effective at very close ranges. Within arm's reach, it was nearly silent. But its effective range was measured in meters rather than tens of meters. It fired a pistol cartridge with limited stopping power, and it was a single-shot weapon that required manual cycling between rounds. In an emergency, those limitations could be fatal to the operator rather than the target. Suppressor attachments fitted to standard service weapons, the Sten submachine gun with its crude bolt-on suppressors, various modified Lee Enfield attempts, were scarcely better. The fundamental problem was that a conventional suppressor attached to the outside of an existing weapon could only do so much. The noise of a gunshot has two sources: the expanding gases that propel the bullet, and the supersonic crack produced by a projectile traveling faster than the speed of sound, which is approximately 343 meters per second. Standard suppressors could partially muffle the first of these. They could do nothing about the second. If you wanted a truly silent weapon, you needed two things simultaneously: a method of capturing and cooling the expanding gases inside an integrated suppressor housing, and a cartridge that fired its bullet at subsonic velocities, slower than sound, and therefore producing no crack whatsoever. Achieving both of those things in a weapon robust enough for field conditions, accurate enough to be useful at meaningful ranges, and compact enough to be concealed under a coat, that was the challenge. Nobody had done it. Not reliably. Not with a weapon capable of delivering the kind of stopping power a soldier might actually trust his life to. The man who solved this problem was a draftsman named William Godfrey de Lisle. He worked not in some sprawling government establishment, but at the Ford Motor Company's facility at Dagenham in Essex, where he had spent the war years designing rather less glamorous things than silent killing implements. De Lisle came to the problem not as a weapons engineer, but as a practical designer, a man who looked at mechanical systems and saw their inefficiencies with the cold clarity of someone trained to eliminate them. His proposal, submitted to the War Office and eventually taken up by the Special Operations Executive, was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than adapting an existing weapon to accept a suppressor, the approach that had produced such mediocre results elsewhere, he would build the suppressor and the weapon as a single, unified system, designed together from first principles. The suppressor would not be an addition to the gun. It would be the gun. De Lisle began with the action of the Lee Enfield rifle, Britain's standard service weapon, and one of the most reliable bolt-action mechanisms ever produced. He took the receiver and the bolt assembly and adapted them to accept a different cartridge entirely, the .45 ACP, the same round used in the American M1911 pistol. This was not an arbitrary choice. The .45 ACP is a large, heavy pistol cartridge that travels at approximately 260 meters per second, well below the speed of sound. By selecting this ammunition, de Lisle had eliminated the supersonic crack problem entirely. His weapon would never fire a round fast enough to break the sound barrier. Whatever noise remained would come only from the mechanical action of the bolt and the expanding gases, and those could be managed. The barrel he designed was shorter than a standard rifle barrel, roughly 184 millimeters, approximately the length of a man's forearm from wrist to elbow. Around and ahead of this barrel, he built the suppressor housing, a cylindrical metal tube, roughly the diameter of a wine bottle and perhaps twice the length, packed internally with a series of baffles. These baffles, simple metal discs with holes in them stacked in sequence, were designed to trap the expanding propellant gases as they followed the bullet out of the barrel, forcing them to expand into a series of chambers rather than all at once. Each expansion absorbed energy and dissipated heat. By the time the gases reached the muzzle end of the suppressor, they had cooled and slowed to the point where their exit produced, in testing conditions, a sound level somewhere in the region of 85 decibels, roughly equivalent to a car door closing or a typewriter being struck with some force. The stock was adapted from a Lee Enfield, but modified to accept the wider magazine of a Thompson submachine gun, also chambered in .45 ACP, which fed rounds into the action from below. The overall length of the assembled weapon was approximately 960 millimeters, or just under a meter. It weighed roughly 3.7 kilograms when loaded. Heavier than a standard carbine, the suppressor accounting for much of that weight. but manageable enough for field use. Prototypes were produced at the Sterling Engineering Company in Dagenham, working in conditions of strict secrecy. The weapon went through several development iterations, addressing issues with gas sealing and baffle durability before production versions were finally approved. Exact production numbers remain uncertain. Estimates suggest no more than 100 to 130 were produced in total across various marques and variants, though some sources place the figure slightly higher. The secrecy surrounding the program was such that detailed records were either never kept or were subsequently destroyed, a practice common to SOE operations of this period. The Lisle entered service during 1943 and saw operational deployment primarily in the latter years of the Second World War and into the early post-war period. Its principal users were SOE agents, British commandos, and members of the Special Air Service, though the precise operational record is, inevitably, deeply incomplete. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. What is documented suggests a weapon that performed in the field very close to what it had achieved in testing. Operators who trained with the Lisle consistently described its report as remarkable. Not the dramatic Hollywood silence of fiction, but genuinely indistinguishable at distances beyond a few meters from ambient sound. A night operation in a rural setting with wind in the trees and the ordinary sounds of countryside could absorb the report of the Lisle entirely. At indoor distances, the loudest sound associated with the weapon was frequently described as the bolt cycling, a mechanical clunk of metal on metal that the integrated suppressor did nothing to address. Weapons saw use in operations across Northwest Europe in the Far East Theatre, where British and Commonwealth Special Forces conducted extensive guerrilla operations in the jungles of Burma and Malaya, and in various roles that remain, to this day, either redacted or simply unrecorded. Some accounts from post-war interviews with SOE personnel describe the Lisle being used in precisely the scenarios it was designed for: the removal of sentries, the silencing of lookouts, operations where the sound of a shot would have compromised not only the mission but the lives of everyone involved. These accounts are consistent, but must be treated with the appropriate caution of oral history: vivid, plausible, and impossible to independently verify. What is beyond dispute is that the weapon worked. The technical achievement it represented was real, demonstrated in controlled conditions by the War Office itself. The operational record, fragmentary as it is, does not suggest a weapon that failed its purpose. It suggests, rather, a weapon so perfectly suited to its purpose that the operations it enabled left very little trace at all. To appreciate the Lisle's achievement, it helps to consider what others were doing, or rather failing to do, at the same moment. The Germans, who were certainly not ignorant of the problem of noise suppression, produced their own suppressed weapons during the Second World War. The most notable was the Welrod's German equivalent, the Granatbüchse MS, and various suppressed variants of the MP40 submachine gun. These achieved meaningful sound reduction, but were, almost without exception, bolt-on solutions. Suppressors attached to existing weapons that addressed only half the problem. German submachine guns fired standard 9mm parabellum ammunition, which is supersonic. No bolt-on suppressor, regardless of its quality, could eliminate the crack of a supersonic round. German suppressed weapons were quieter than their unsuppressed counterparts. They were not silent. The Americans produced the high-standard HDM pistol, a suppressed .22 caliber semi-automatic issued to the Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOE. The HDM was genuinely effective at close range, quiet and reliable, and chambered for .22 long rifle ammunition traveling at subsonic velocities. But .22 long rifle is a small caliber round with limited terminal effect, and the HDM was a pistol, effective at arm's length, marginal at 10 meters, and useless at 40. It occupied a different operational niche to the Lisle entirely. The Lisle's combination of subsonic pistol caliber ammunition, integral suppressor, and shoulder-fired bolt-action platform gave it a meaningful effective range. Estimates typically cite 200 to 250 meters for a competent operator, though practical tactical use concentrated at far shorter distances, that no other suppressed weapon of the period came close to matching. It was not more powerful than a standard rifle. It was not more accurate over long distances. But at the ranges where covert operations required precise, silent, reliable fire, it occupied a space that simply did not exist in any other nation's arsenal. The concept it pioneered, integral suppressor, subsonic cartridge, shoulder-fired platform, would go on to influence suppressed weapons development for decades. The Soviet VSS Vintores, the British L-34A1 Sterling submachine gun, the various suppressed platforms developed during the Cold War by intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain. All of them owe a philosophical debt to the approach de Lisle worked out in Dagenham in 1942. Assessing the de Lisle's impact on the Second World War is an exercise in appropriate humility. The weapon was produced in tiny numbers. It saw limited operational deployment. The war was decided ultimately by industrial production, logistics, manpower, and the grinding attrition of conventional military operations on a scale that de Lisle could not influence in any material sense. No battle was won because of the de Lisle. No campaign turned on its presence or absence. But this is to measure the wrong things. The de Lisle was not a weapon of battles. It was a weapon of operations, small, precise, surgical. And the value of those operations is not measured in casualty statistics, but in information gathered, networks protected, routes kept open, and the particular cumulative effect of making the enemy uncertain. When sentries go silent without explanation, when couriers disappear without gunfire, when the machinery of occupation develops unexplained failures in its human components, this produces a form of anxiety that has no name in conventional military accounting, but is corrosive to morale and operational efficiency in ways that prove, over time, significant. Several examples of the de Lisle survive today. The Pattern Room collection, now housed at the Royal Armouries at Leeds, holds examples alongside documentation of the weapon's development. The Imperial War Museum in London holds further examples. Private collections account for additional surviving weapons, though export restrictions and the weapons classification as a Section 5 firearm under British law mean that most legal holders are institutions rather than individuals. They are strange objects to encounter in a museum case, compact, utilitarian. The suppressor housing, dull with age, the stock worn smooth in the places where hands gripped it. They look less like weapons of war than like pieces of plumbing, which is, in a sense, precisely what they are. The engineering is visible in them even now. The practical, unfussy problem-solving of a man who understood that the best solution is the one that addresses every part of the problem at once. Return for a moment to that village square in Normandy. The night, the lamp, the sentry, the cigarette, the figure in the hedgerow, with the ungainly weapon at his shoulder. What de Lisle built was, at its heart, a simple thing, a mechanism for making death quiet. The moral weight of that can be set aside. Warfare has always involved killing, and the particular quietness of one method versus another changes the calculus for the operator and the mission, not the fundamental nature of the act. What matters in the context of what de Lisle actually achieved is the engineering. He began with a problem that had defeated every previous attempt. He identified the two distinct sources of the problem, the gas explosion and the supersonic crack, and he addressed both simultaneously at the design stage rather than trying to patch a solution onto a system already built around different assumptions. He chose his cartridge because of its ballistic properties rather than its conventional military utility. He designed his suppressor not as an accessory, but as a structural element of the weapon itself. He produced, in doing so, something that had not existed before: a shoulder-fired weapon capable of precise fire at genuine operational ranges, producing a report that was, for all meaningful practical purposes, inaudible. The de Lisle was never mass-produced. It never shaped the course of a single major battle. Its operators completed their missions and left no records. The weapon itself sat in museum cases for decades, recognized mainly by specialists and military historians with an interest in the esoteric corners of Second World War material culture. But the problem it solved, how do you fire a rifle and leave silence behind you, was real, and it mattered, and nobody else solved it. Not the Germans, not the Americans, not any other nation that tried. A draftsman from Dagenham solved it alone in 1942. He built roughly 100 of them. A few dozen survive. And the men who used them went about their work in the dark, and the sentries fell, and nobody heard a thing. That is, in the end, precisely the point.